This whole thing started as a twisted joke, or maybe just boredom taken too far. I was in a dark place, mentally, emotionally. Life was dull, like everything around me was draining the color out of the world, and I found myself scrolling through the kind of dark web forums you're not supposed to talk about. Places where anonymity gives people a sense of invincibility and rules don't really exist. At first I was just looking like a tourist in hell. But somewhere along the line, I stumbled across a service that made me pause, a Hitman for hire forum. The kind you think only exists in urban legends, but it was real. I knew because the testimonials weren't just vague, 10/10 would hire again nonsense. They were detailed, too detailed. One guy wrote about how he ordered the hit on his abusive stepfather and even got updates through photos as it happened, down to the step-by-step cleanup of the scene. I remember staring at the screen, letting the idea fester. I was drunk, half out of my mind, and then it hit me. A ridiculous thought. What if I hired someone to kill me? What if I could feel what it's like, knowing my days are numbered? Knowing death is on its way, and there's nothing I can do. It felt like a way to prove something to myself. How close could I get to death before I'd actually feel alive? I filled out the request form, still not believing I'd go through with it. It asked for details, address, time preference, payment in Bitcoin. And under target, I just typed my own name. The rush I felt in that moment was intoxicating. I laughed as I typed out the instructions. Come get me, let's see if you can. It wasn't until the next day that I realized I'd actually sent the payment, half up front, non-refundable. I thought about cancelling, but there was no option for that, and the paranoia set in fast. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it was probably a scam. But a message hit my encrypted inbox 2 days later. Your contract has been accepted. Your hunter will contact you within 72 hours. I won't lie, I threw up when I read that. I could feel my stomach twist, like it was being wrung out like a dirty towel. This was no joke, it was happening. I'd hired someone to kill me, and they were on their way. But instead of panic, I felt a weird kind of excitement, like the fear was wrapping itself around me and squeezing so tight it became exhilarating. On the third day, I started noticing things that didn't seem right. Cars I didn't recognize parked near my apartment. A man in a hoodie sitting on a bench across the street, pretending to scroll on his phone but glancing toward my building every few minutes. That's when I knew for sure. The hunter was here, and he was watching me. I decided to play it cool. I still had a choice: lay down and die, or flip the script and become the hunter. The thought clicked in my brain like a switch. If this guy thought I was some depressed loser, an easy target, he was dead wrong. I went out that night and bought a burner phone, duct tape, rope, gloves, and a cheap combat knife from a sketchy surplus store. I stayed up all night pacing in my apartment, waiting for him to make his move. The first contact came a day later. It was subtle, too subtle. A knock at the door at 3 a.m. I stayed silent, watching through the peephole. The hallway light flickered, and I caught a glimpse of him, a pale, gaunt man wearing a black hoodie, face half covered by a surgical mask. He knocked again, softly, almost politely. I didn't answer. I watched him pull a small card out of his pocket and slide it under my door. The card had only 2 words printed on it. Not yet. That's when I knew this guy was toying with me. He wanted to draw this out, make me paranoid, break me down until I was a nervous wreck. But I wasn't going to break. If anything, this was starting to feel like a game I could win. The next few days were a cat-and-mouse nightmare. I knew he was close, too close. He was in my neighborhood, lurking in the shadows like a ghost. I caught glimpses of him through windows, reflected in shop glass, always just far enough away that I couldn't confront him directly. He was stalking me, learning my routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But what he didn't realize was that I was learning about him too. I started tracking his movements, memorizing the times he appeared and disappeared. I even managed to follow him one night, keeping to the shadows as he wandered through back alleys and abandoned parking lots. It was terrifying, but also thrilling. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. It was like the fear had become a drug, and I was addicted. The moment I knew I had the upper hand was when I found his stash. He'd rented a storage unit about 2 blocks from my apartment, probably as a base to monitor me without drawing suspicion. Inside, I found all kinds of creepy stuff. Polaroids of me taken through my apartment windows, a notebook filled with bizarre scribbles about target routines and entry points, and even a length of rope and plastic sheets, prepped for whatever he had planned for me. And that's when I realized he wasn't just some hitman. This guy was a full-blown sadist. He wasn't just going to kill me, he was going to enjoy it. I felt my throat tighten as I stared at those Polaroids. He'd been watching me sleep, watching me eat, shower, live. I was nothing more than prey to him, a rabbit waiting to get caught in his trap. But what he didn't know was that I'd already set my own trap for him. That night, I didn't go to bed. I waited. Armed with the knife, duct tape and rope, I sat in the dark corner of my apartment, breathing slowly, listening for every creak and groan of the building. At 2:47 a.m., I heard the door handle rattle. The lock clicked. He was inside. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away, but I stayed perfectly still, watching him creep into the apartment like a shadow. He was good, silent, deliberate. He knew what he was doing, but I was better. He made his way toward my bedroom, the knife in his hand catching the faintest glimmer of moonlight through the curtains. I could almost feel the weight of his intentions, heavy and suffocating. The moment he reached the bed and realized I wasn't in it, I pounced. I tackled him from behind, driving the knife into his shoulder. He screamed, a wet, guttural sound that echoed off the walls, but I didn't stop. I pinned him down, pressing the blade deeper until it hit bone. He struggled, thrashing like a wild animal, but I was relentless. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about winning. I wanted him to know what it felt like to be the prey. I used the duct tape to bind his wrists and ankles, then dragged him, kicking and screaming, into the bathroom. He was mine now, and I wasn't going to let him go easily. This was just the beginning. The real nightmare was only starting, and I knew, somewhere deep down, this wasn't going to end well for either of us. But for now, I was the one in control, and that felt better than anything I'd ever experienced in my entire life. There's a strange thing that happens when you look into someone's eyes and see that they know they're about to die. It's like every mask they've ever worn drops away, and what's left is the raw, desperate core of a person. That's what I saw when I flipped the bathroom light on and stared down at the guy I had tied up. He wasn't so threatening now, just a broken man bleeding from his shoulder, eyes darting around like a cornered animal. His breathing was shallow, quick. I could tell he was calculating his odds, looking for a way out. Spoiler alert, there wasn't one. The shower curtain was ripped halfway off its rod from when I'd dragged him into the tub. His clothes were soaked in his own sweat and blood, sticking to him like a second skin. He kept making these little sounds, like a whimper trying to stay hidden behind clenched teeth. He thought I'd kill him fast. But I wasn't planning on being generous. I grabbed a roll of duct tape and tore off a strip, slapping it over his mouth before he could start begging. The last thing I wanted was to listen to some pathetic attempt at bargaining. His eyes bulged as he squirmed, the muffled groans leaking out under the tape. I knelt down beside him, knife still in hand, and tilted my head. "You were going to kill me, huh?" I whispered, watching his pupils dilate. "You came all this way just to make me disappear." He tried to shake his head, but I wasn't buying it. The knife hovered just above his skin, tracing a lazy line along his cheek. His whole body went rigid, like he thought one wrong move might make me snap. And he was right. I was enjoying myself way too much, and I knew it. This wasn't just about self-defense anymore. This was about control, something I hadn't felt in years. It was intoxicating. I never realized how much I needed it until I had this man lying at my feet, helpless and terrified. I leaned closer, so close I could smell the fear on him, like sour sweat mixed with cheap cologne. His eyes flicked down to the knife, and I smiled. "You've been watching me for a while, haven't you?" I whispered. "Taking pictures, figuring out my schedule, thinking about how you were going to do it." His breathing hitched. I could feel the panic radiating off him like heat. He was crumbling right in front of me, and it was beautiful. I pressed the knife against his skin, just enough to make him understand how serious I was. "Guess what?" I murmured. "Now I get to decide what happens next." There's something unsettling about holding a knife to another human being and realizing just how easy it is to ruin them. Skin is fragile. It doesn't take much pressure to break it, to make someone bleed. I could have done anything to him in that moment. Anything. I slid the blade down his arm, slow and deliberate, watching the skin part under the steel. It wasn't a deep cut, just enough to let him know I wasn't bluffing. He let out a muffled scream behind the tape, thrashing in the tub like a fish out of water. Blood dripped down his arm in thin, bright red trails. The sight of it made my heart race. I felt alive. I pulled a chair into the bathroom and sat down, watching him writhe in pain. My brain was buzzing with adrenaline, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer excitement of it all. This was my moment. For once in my life, I was the one in control. "So, what now?" I asked, though I knew he couldn't answer with the tape over his mouth. "You thought you were the predator. Thought you were going to sneak in here and end me like it's just another Tuesday. Well, surprise, asshole." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the bathroom tiles. He looked up at me, eyes wide and filled with something I hadn't seen before, pure, unfiltered terror. That's when I decided to take it to the next level. I needed answers. I needed to know everything. I ripped the tape off his mouth in one quick motion, and he let out a pained gasp, his lips raw and swollen. He coughed, spitting out a glob of saliva mixed with blood. I crouched down in front of him, close enough to feel the heat of his breath on my face. "Who sent you?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady. He shook his head, panic flashing in his eyes. "No one. It was just the contract." "Bullshit," I snapped, slamming the knife into the wall next to his head. He flinched so hard his head smacked against the tiles. "Tell me the truth. Who the fuck paid you?" "I swear," he whimpered, his voice shaking. It was you. You paid me." Hearing those words out loud was surreal, like a punch to the gut. He was telling the truth. I had hired him. This was all my doing. And now he was mine. A sick idea crept into my mind, one I couldn't ignore. I wanted to see how far I could push him, how much I could make him beg, how long it would take before he broke completely. I grabbed his phone from his pocket and forced his face against the screen to unlock it. It took a couple of tries. He was shaking too much, but eventually it worked. I scrolled through his messages, his contacts, his photos, and that's when I found it. A folder labeled trophies. Inside were pictures of his previous victims, dozens of them, men, women, even a couple of kids. Some of the photos were taken before the murders, some after. The last one was particularly disturbing, a close-up of a woman's face, her eyes still open, staring blankly at the camera. I felt something twist in my gut, a mix of disgust and fascination. This guy wasn't just a hitman, he was a monster, and now he was at my mercy. For a long moment, I just stared at him, the weight of what I'd discovered settling over me like a thick fog. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting, anticipating what I'd do next. He knew he was fucked. "What's the matter?" I asked, tilting my head. "You don't like it when the roles are reversed?" He didn't respond. Just sat there, breathing hard, his whole body trembling. I could see it in his eyes, the realization that this wasn't going to end well for him. Not even close. And for the first time in my life, I smiled. The plan was forming in my mind, piece by piece, and it was dark. Darker than anything I'd ever imagined. But I didn't care. This was my game now. My rules. I grabbed the rope and started tying his wrists together, tighter this time. He didn't even fight it. He knew it was pointless. I tied his ankles next, securing him in place. He wasn't going anywhere. Then I leaned in close, whispering in his ear, "We're going to have a lot of fun, you and me. But first, I think you owe me something." He looked at me, confused, fear flickering across his face. "You owe me my money back," I said, grinning. And that's when I knew I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to enjoy every second of it. The first thing I did after securing him was take his wallet. I wanted to know who he really was, not the alias he used on the dark web, but the man sitting in front of me. His ID told me his name was Eric Scott, just an average-sounding name for someone who had killed people like it was a job. That pissed me off for some reason. It made him feel too real, not some phantom assassin, but a regular guy who bought groceries, maybe had a dog or a girlfriend somewhere. I flipped through the rest of his wallet. A couple of crumpled bills, some old receipts, and a photo tucked into one of the pockets. I unfolded it and felt my stomach knot. It was a picture of a kid, a little girl, maybe 5 years old, with curly blonde hair and a missing front tooth. She was smiling like the world hadn't gotten to her yet, holding a stuffed bear in her arms. On the back of the photo, in neat handwriting, were the words, "For Daddy, love, Emma." I stared at that photo for a long time, feeling something dark creep into my mind. This guy had a kid. That shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Somehow, it made what I was about to do even more satisfying. Eric saw me holding the photo and made a sound like he was trying to talk, but I wasn't ready to listen. I jammed the picture into my pocket and gave him a look that shut him up instantly. "You don't get to talk about her," I said, my voice flat and cold. He nodded, his eyes glassy with tears. For a moment I wondered if he was actually sorry, if he regretted any of the people he had killed. But that moment passed quickly. People like him don't regret anything. I left him in the bathroom for a while, tied up and bleeding, while I paced around the apartment trying to figure out my next move. I had him. I owned him now. But the question was, how far was I willing to go? The logical part of my brain told me to call the cops, turn him in. But I knew that wasn't going to happen. If I called the cops, I'd have to explain everything. How I hired him, how I lured him here, how I tied him up. I'd end up in prison right alongside him. That wasn't an option. By the time I went back into the bathroom, he was pale and shivering. His shoulder wound wasn't fatal, but it wasn't pretty either. Blood soaked through his hoodie, and I could see him struggling to stay conscious. He looked up at me with glassy eyes, like he was starting to realize just how bad this was going to get. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I have a kid." I knelt down beside him, forcing him to meet my gaze. "And how many kids did your victims have?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "How many of them begged you to stop before you slit their throats?" He didn't answer, just stared at me with that pathetic, broken look, and for a second, I almost felt bad for him. Almost. I grabbed his phone again, scrolling through the messages and photos. I found conversations between him and other clients, people just like me, hiring him to do their dirty work. The sheer casualness of it all made me sick. One guy had asked if he could get a discount if the target was elderly. Another wanted photos of the kill as a bonus. Eric had responded to each message like it was just another day at the office. No remorse, no hesitation. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to let him off easy. He deserved worse than death. I started small. Nothing too extreme, just enough to let him know that I was in charge now. I made him tell me everything. Every detail about his past hits. How he stalked them, how he broke into their homes, how he got away without leaving a trace. He talked through gritted teeth, his body trembling from blood loss and fear. The things he told me, they weren't just murders, they were executions. He didn't just kill people, he made them suffer. He liked it. That's when I knew there was no turning back. I had to finish what I started.
I pulled up the dark web forum where I'd hired him and logged into my account. The messages between us were still there, and I knew they'd stay there unless someone deleted them. That gave me an idea. A twisted, terrible idea. I opened a new thread on the forum using his account. I wrote, "Target neutralized, buyer reconsidered, contract terminated, proceeding to clean up." And then I attached a photo of him, tied up in my bathtub, bleeding and helpless. The post went live instantly, and within minutes the replies started rolling in. "Nice work. That was quick. Clean job. Respect." I smiled. They thought he was the one writing it, updating them on the job he was supposed to do. They had no idea he was the one in the picture. Eric's face went pale as he watched me type. He knew what I was doing. I was erasing him, making it look like he'd completed the job and disappeared, just like his other victims. "No, please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I ignored him, closing the laptop with a satisfied click. "Looks like your reputation's intact," I said, grinning. "You'll be remembered as a professional to the very end." He let out a shaky breath, his whole body sagging like a puppet with its strings cut. He knew it was over. I sat back and stared at him, my mind racing with possibilities. I could let him bleed out here, slowly and painfully. Or I could call one of his contacts, pretend to be him, set up another job, and see how far I could push this game. The options were endless. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control. I stayed up all night, sitting in that bathroom, watching him. I wanted to see the moment he realized that there was no way out, no escape, only me. By morning, his breathing had slowed to a faint rattling wheeze. He was fading fast, slipping away inch by inch. And I knew then that it was almost time to finish it. But not yet. I wasn't done with him. The next morning, the bathroom smelled like sweat, blood, and something sour, like old copper pennies. Eric was barely conscious, slipping in and out of awareness. Every time his head drooped forward, I'd slap him hard enough to jolt him awake. He'd cough, wheeze, and try to form words, but I wasn't interested in anything he had to say. The look on his face was pathetic, like an animal caught in a trap that knows it won't get free. I figured it was time to raise the stakes, let him know exactly what kind of hell he'd wandered into. I picked up the combat knife, giving it a lazy twirl in my hand as I crouched down next to him. His skin had gone pale from the blood loss, and his lips were cracked and dry. He wasn't going to last much longer if I didn't give him water, but that was part of the plan. I wanted him weak. I leaned in close enough for him to smell the sweat on me. "So here's the thing, Eric," I said, keeping my voice calm. "You were supposed to kill me. That was the deal, right? But instead, look where you are."
His head tilted slightly like he was trying to figure out what game I was playing. I saw fear flicker in his eyes, but there was something else there too, anger. The same kind of anger I imagine he felt when one of his targets tried to fight back. It made me grin. "Now, I have to ask..." I tapped the knife against his cheek, just enough to make him flinch. "How does it feel to be on the other side of things? How does it feel to be the prey?" He didn't answer, so I pressed the knife harder until a thin line of blood appeared on his skin. He winced, sucking in a breath through clenched teeth. "Feels like shit, doesn't it?" I whispered. I grabbed a bottle of water from the kitchen and dangled it in front of him. His eyes locked on it like a starving dog. I unscrewed the cap slowly, letting him hear the crack of the seal, and took a long, deliberate sip. "Thirsty?" I asked. He nodded, lips trembling. I poured a small stream of water onto the floor just to mess with him. He let out a weak, desperate noise, shifting against the ropes binding his wrists. I knelt down and tilted the bottle toward his mouth, but just as he opened it, I pulled it away again. "That's how it feels," I said, grinning. "That's how it feels to be powerless." The day dragged on, each hour stretching into eternity. I kept him alive. Barely. I gave him just enough water to keep him conscious and poked at his wounds to keep the pain fresh. The more he suffered, the more control I felt. It was like every minute he spent tied up in that bathtub was a reminder that I had won. But even with all the fear in his eyes, there was still a part of him that thought he could get out of this. I could see it, that glimmer of hope. He thought if he played along long enough, I'd mess up, give him an opening. I wasn't going to give him that chance. By the second night, he was starting to break. His voice was hoarse from dehydration, his movements sluggish and weak. Every time he shifted, he winced from the pain in his shoulder. "Why?" he croaked at one point, barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" I stared at him for a long moment, the knife still in my hand. Why was I doing this? The truth was, I didn't know anymore. What had started as some twisted game had turned into something darker, something I couldn't quite explain. "You came for me," I said finally. "Now I get to decide how it ends." That night, I took things a step further. I used his phone to message some of his contacts, just a few vague texts, enough to make them think he was still active. I wanted them to believe that everything was business as usual. One of the messages was from a potential client, asking if he'd be available for a job in 2 days. I replied, "Sure, send details." Eric watched me from the tub, his expression a mix of fear and confusion. He didn't know what I was planning, and I could tell it was driving him insane. Good. Let him stew. The next morning, I decided to let him in on the plan. "You know, Eric," I said, dragging a chair into the bathroom and sitting down in front of him, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time we wrap this up." His eyes widened, hope flickering to life. He thought I was going to let him go. He was wrong. "I'm going to finish what you started," I said, leaning in closer. "I'm going to kill you, but here's the fun part. I'm going to make it look like you did it yourself." His face twisted in horror, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not fear of pain, but fear of what I was going to do to his name. "You're going to disappear," I whispered, "and no one will ever know what really happened, just like all those people you killed." I spent the next few hours setting the stage. I wiped down everything he'd touched, making sure there were no fingerprints, no evidence that he'd ever been in my apartment. I left his phone unlocked on the bathroom floor, the text conversations open and ready. And then I waited. Eric didn't say much after that. I think he knew it was over, really over. There was no bargaining, no begging, just silence, broken only by the occasional ragged breath. When the time came, I stood over him with the knife in my hand, watching his chest rise and fall one last time. "Any last words?" I asked. He looked up at me, his eyes dull and lifeless, and then to my surprise he smiled. "You'll be just like me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sooner or later, you'll be just like me." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't let it show. I raised the knife, my grip steady, and plunged it into his chest. He gasped, his body convulsing once, twice, and then he was still. I sat there for a long time, staring at the lifeless body in the tub. It was done. The nightmare was over. Or so I thought. I thought I'd feel something after it was over. Satisfaction, maybe relief. But as I stood there, staring down at Eric's lifeless body in my bathtub, there was nothing. Just a hollow silence that crept into my bones like cold air in winter. The apartment felt dead, like all the energy had drained out of it. I wiped the knife on a towel, tossed it into the garbage bag with his phone and wallet, and started cleaning up. I went through the motions like a robot, scrubbing away the blood, bleaching the tiles, making sure everything was spotless. It had to look perfect. Eric had been right about one thing. I was just like him now. It was about 3 a.m. when I finally dragged his body out of the apartment. I had wrapped him in the plastic sheets he'd brought with him, the ones he'd planned to use on me. Fitting, really. I stuffed him into the trunk of my car, careful not to leave any trace behind. There's something surreal about driving through the city with a dead body in your trunk. The streets were mostly empty,
just a few cars here and there, but every time I saw headlights in my rearview mirror, my heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't get caught. Not now. I kept driving until I reached the outskirts of town, to a stretch of abandoned industrial buildings I knew no one went to. I parked behind a crumbling warehouse, far enough away from the road that no one would see me. The night air was heavy, thick with the smell of rain and decay. Perfect for what I had to do next. I didn't waste time. I dragged Eric's body out of the trunk and dumped it in a shallow ditch behind the building. His body hit the ground with a dull thud, the plastic sheets unraveling just enough to reveal his face. His eyes were open, staring blankly at nothing, and for a moment I froze. What if someone found him? But I shook the thought off. No one came here. No one would ever find him. I covered him with dirt and debris, hiding the body as best I could in the darkness. I worked fast, my hands shaking from the adrenaline, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts I couldn't hold on to. When it was done, I stood over the makeshift grave, my chest heaving. It was over, or at least it should have been. For the next few days, I tried to go back to normal. I cleaned the apartment until it was spotless, got rid of the burner phone, and tried to erase every trace of what had happened. I kept telling myself it was fine, that no one knew. No one could connect me to Eric. He was gone, and I was safe. But something wasn't right. It started small, little things I would notice around the apartment. The door would be slightly ajar when I knew I had locked it. A light would be on that I hadn't turned on. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. My mind was playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. That's what I told myself. But then I found the picture. It was a normal morning. I'd woken up early, groggy from another sleepless night. When I walked into the kitchen, there was a photograph lying on the counter. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. It was the photo of his daughter, the same one I'd taken from his wallet, the one I had burned with the rest of his things. But here it was, perfectly intact, staring up at me. My blood went cold. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, my heart racing. On the back, in that same neat handwriting, were the words, "For Daddy, love, Emma." I dropped the photo, stumbling back. How the hell was it here? I had burned it. I had burned everything. That night I barely slept. Every noise, every creak of the apartment made me jump. I kept the lights on, knife tucked under my pillow, waiting for something, for him. And then, just past midnight, I heard the knock at the door. My blood froze. I didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, steady, persistent. I crept toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked through the peephole, half expecting to see a cop, maybe a neighbor. But when I looked, there was no one there, just the empty hallway, dimly lit by the flickering light bulb. I waited, breathless, my hand gripping the door handle, and then the knock came again. This time from inside the apartment. I spun around, knife in hand, but there was nothing. The apartment was silent. I checked every room, every corner, but I was alone. Or so I thought. The next morning I found another photograph on my bed. This one was different. It wasn't of his daughter. It was of me, taken through my bedroom window while I slept. I stared at the photo, my hands trembling. I checked the window, checked every lock, but everything was secure. No one had been inside, but someone had taken that photo. Over the next few days, the knocks continued. They came at random times, sometimes from the door, sometimes from inside the apartment. And every time, I would find another photo. Sometimes it was of me, sometimes of Eric's daughter. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My mind was unraveling, coming apart at the seams. I had killed him. I had killed Eric. So why the hell couldn't I escape him? The final straw came one night when I was sitting in the living room, the TV flickering in the background. The knock came again, loud and insistent. I didn't even bother getting up this time. I knew what it was. But then, I heard his voice. "You'll be just like me." I bolted out of my seat, rushing to the door, but when I threw it open, the hallway was empty. The only thing waiting for me was a photograph taped to the door. I ripped it off, my hands shaking, and stared at it. It was me, lying in the bathtub, bleeding out from a wound in my chest. The exact scene I had created for Eric. But this time, it was me. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. He's not gone. Somehow, someway, he's still here, watching me, haunting me. And now I can't stop thinking about his last words. You'll be just like me. I don't know what that means. Maybe I don't want to know. But I'm starting to understand that this isn't over. It's just beginning.